Hi, Mijos and Mijas. Welcome back to the Mijo podcast. I'm Axel Perez, your host, and today I'm joined by an amazing woman, Giselle Carrillo. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Axel. So excited.
Little backstory on how we met. We met through a mutual friend. Magali was has known you since childhood, right? Is that
Oh, wait,
correct?
it's correct. We actually grew up more like cousins, and so in my mind, she's my cousin. She's prima, but technically a family friend.
That's true. Yes. So you guys knew each other that way and have known each other for years. And then I started working with Magali and, we started a nonprofit together and we featured you as our champion in the community. So, I got to know you through doing some in person like research, I guess, of Los Courage camps and what you guys were doing. So it was really inspiring. And I'm happy to now bring you on to this endeavor and have you come on through this side of the podcast. But first and foremost, I'd like to start with just getting to know a little bit about you.
Okay, well, again, thank you for having me. It's always an honor to get to talk about my story. In some ways, it's unique, but in some ways, it's all of us. But I am a Latina born and raised in East LA. I am the daughter of immigrants, and I say that so proudly nowadays, who really, I think lived a life early on that is like a lot of us, trying to raise up our community, raise up our families with us. My path was more so through education. I actually never really got a chance to do anything extracurricular because I was laser focused on being the first person in my family to make it to college and have a steady career. And in all of that, really, I sacrificed a lot and mainly my joy and my passion. The word passion really didn't come into my vocabulary or my understanding until what I call my quarter life crisis, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. Since that point, when I just decided to do things that made me happy, which also isn't a word that a lot of Latino households talk about, um, that point changed everything in my life. I changed my career. I changed my health. I was pre-diabetic, really on a path to repeat what the rest of my family had done in terms of health. I wrote a children's book. I've been featured on television shows through following my passion. So really, I think what I want to get across today is that living your passion is very, very bountiful. And I'm a proud Latina that has really done things that other Latinas in my family never got to do. And so being the first is absolutely okay.
And I know you mentioned a little bit about, having to sacrifice extracurricular activities and really just being focused on education. I think that's something that a lot of Latinos go through. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. For me personally, like we didn't have the access to these like lavish programs or really the means to fund these type of extracurricular activities. So education was really just like our only way out, where it was like focus on education, get a degree, get a good job that pays you tons of money so that you can just be well off. And I think everyone goes through a story of finding themselves and finding what activities they like. And, for you, it's like finding that point where you said, I'm going to change this around and focus on my health and focus on these activities. Would you say there was a time where you felt something was missing growing up in your childhood?
I think it was more when I left East LA and went to school by the beach. And, you know, I went to Loyola Marymount and it was a beautiful campus, but I didn't realize how different my experience had been as a brown girl who was living really at poverty. And I never felt poor growing up, but through the contrast of then going to a private university where I was, one of a handful of Latino kids from East LA. Maybe there were a couple of us. My, the difference in my upbringing really became apparent. And I started to see that like people weren't raised with the hardships that I was raised, from struggling to have food in some ways. There was always a shelter over our heads, but life wasn't always easy. And I think where I realized that was many little moments when I was in university, and specifically, and I know we'll probably talk about my story with the ocean and surfing. I remember that was one of the first places where I got to see people that like were happy and were kind of having moments of leisure, specifically surfers at my university. Surfers who would leave class in the middle of the day. Obviously, you don't have class all day when you're in college, and go out and surf and come back with sand in their hair and their toes, and they just look so happy. And that was a little seed for me, but that seed didn't really become anything until I grew up a little bit more and realized that there were a lot of experiences that I really never got to tap into, from traveling to experiencing the beach here in LA to like, hey, what if I do chase my dream? And so I think it started to unfold in college, but really took a turn in a really dark moment in my life where I was 5 years into teaching. I loved teaching, but the system made it very challenging. And I remember there was just a particular day that I woke up with no ganas. Like, I did not want to do it. I did not want to get up. I just couldn't even put a foot in front of the other. And what I realize now is that it was depression, something that we don't talk about, like that darkness emotionally. And I remember realizing that I was really just living to pay bills and there was nothing really driving me. And so it's important to know that like you can do what you think you're supposed to do because of what your community tells you can do, but only so long, I would argue. And for me, it really came to a screeching halt. And that depression really was right in my face at 25. So it wasn't one moment. I think it was an accumulation, where you're trying to give from an empty cup. The cup runs out eventually.
100%. And that's a topic that we've talked about on the podcast before, mental health and therapy, and how it's not common in our communities. And our parents sometimes don't believe in these things because of the ways that they grew up and what they were told in regards to these practices growing up. So I think it's really important to uplift each other and to break that stigma within our Latino culture of mental health doesn't happen or isn't a thing, or it's just a phase that you have to get over. What made you pause and reflect at that moment in your life when you realized teaching isn't fulfilling me? I want to chase something greater in life.
I the first thing was to step away from teaching. I actually, after that moment, um, started to just ask myself, like, what would bring me some joy in this moment? I read a book that talked about the Happiness Project. I think that book is still around. And for some of the first chapters just talked about like sleeping, the basics. And we're such a sacrificial community that often even sleep is something we deprioritize. It talked about getting healthy, it talked about movement. But deeper into the book, it talked about um, finding your joy and finding your passion. And one of the first things that like really came up for me is that I needed to leave my job, which is a very scary thing when you are the caregiver for your parents and your family, and that a lot of people rely on you. And I would argue I've done it a couple times now where I take the risk of starting over. And it's not just, a risk like other people from other cultures. This is a 10x risk because there's a lot of people depending on you. So you carry a lot. You're sometimes a safety net for a lot of people. And so first step is I started to let go of teaching, and I, you know, announced my resignation at the end of the year. It wasn't teaching that I didn't like, it was the systems around it. But I did know that I had to get away. And so closing doors, and cutting off things, ending things is absolutely necessary. And I actually spent 3 months doing odd jobs that really, was a check for my ego. I was someone's personal assistant. I was doing part-timers here and there. And at this point, I had my master's degree. And so acknowledging that I was going to figure it out. And really, I think that's where my cup refilled, the wheat that started coming up again. And I started to get clarity and a lot of silence too. I think one of the things I was always raised with is like, you always got to be doing something. And I remember specifically at the time I had moved to a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in Venice where I was living with my sister. So the rent was pretty affordable. We made it work even through me transitioning careers. But I remember I was just sitting in my living room and there was palm trees outside. It wasn't a pretty living room, but uh it was really bringing me the peace and the silence that I needed. And a little idea popped up in my head that I needed to keep teaching, but this time around community, around my new passions. And that's where I started to get an idea that maybe a community movement and finding a new career. I started to get little seeds. And I don't know if you've ever read The Alchemist, but The Alchemist was another book that was incredibly transformative for me. It talked a lot about being the first in your family and sometimes leaving in order to come back with certain answers. And so my path kind of split a little bit. I took on a new career in the health and wellness space, still teaching, essentially becoming an educator, which was a dream. And then the other little split was starting a nonprofit, which became Los Courage Camps.
I think that's something that we get used to as people of color and coming from these communities. It's like we're gonna figure it out. We don't know how, but it's like you said, like we're always working on something, and we're just so used to working hard and working on a project here and there, and it's like it just comes into fruition and it happens with that consistent like commitment and like love being that you said the agüita started filling up your cup and you were able to start pouring into other cups, and I think that's amazing. Before we get into Los Courage Camps, which is a huge part of this episode, when you discovered surfing, did you reflect and often think back to, wait, I don't see a lot of Latinos in surfing, and it's really not something that's big in our culture, the lack of representation. Where did you kind of fall into that when you decided I'm going to be a person of color in surfing, even though it's a sport that we're not predominantly in?
Well, I was looking for my happiness. I knew that I deserved it, even as a brown woman, even having seen generations before me of brown women always working for others and sacrificing for others. And so I felt like it was my right to go find it. And I took on many little passions from martial arts to weightlifting for the first time in my life. Again, I was never an athlete. I was in the academic decathlon team, but never an athlete in the physical way. Um, but surfing came up for me, and kind of back to the story that I mentioned before in college, looking at other people that didn't grow up like me and they had these incredible experiences and they seem like the happiest people, the surfers. Somehow, like the ocean seemed to bring a lot of joy in their lives. And so I was like, I want that joy that is in their faces. But I also say there's little seeds when you grow up that kind of point you to your passion points because similar to, I said martial arts earlier. I loved Karate Kid. I loved Kill Bill as movies. I love seeing like images of martial arts. And when it came to surfing, I remember watching movies about Hawaii, watching Blue Crush, and always thinking like, wow, that looks so cool. But it's not for me. I've never seen a brown person surf. And that narrative, that story, um, held me back from ever thinking that I could do it because I'd never seen someone like me. And kind of going back to the alchemist teaches you like sometimes you're destined to be the first one in your family. And when you make a decision, it will figure itself out. And so I would say once I decided to dive into the waves, me being a brown woman didn't really hold me back. But the years where I was like, oh, it's not for me, before I had the big realization that I needed to go chase my my joy. But it was still hard, even learning and not having any relatives who were surfers. Who would I ask? This was like just at the cusp of Instagram and YouTube. So there was like nobody to guide me, and the only people to turn to were complete strangers. Whereas most people learn from their dad or their brother, I had nobody. And so really figuring something out, it was 100 times harder than it was for anyone else, was quite the journey, but it taught me a lot.
Being the first in your family to take on this new journey, what was your family reaction when you said like, "Hey, I want to be a surfer. Like I'm getting into the ocean and I'm gonna pick up surfing."
Okay, well, in this moment, I'm quitting my job or had already quit my job. Sometimes I forget how all those things stack up. I've moved to Venice, working part-time jobs, somehow paying a rent, and I told them that I want to learn to surf. And both of my parents, no plan B, right? No backup plan. Both of my parents thought I had gone completely crazy. They really saw And we have to, I love my parents so much, but they have certain activities that in their book are like, she's doing fine. And certain activities in their book were like, oh, she's
A
not going to
hundred
be
percent.
okay. Yeah. So I think surfing to them just felt like, the rebels of culture, the ones that don't have jobs and they waste their time. And they were pretty concerned. And I think also not just from like, is she going to be okay in life, but also this doesn't have any job outcomes. What's the goal here? For them, everything has to be connected to some kind of outcome. And surfing doesn't. Still to this day, I don't really have a goal around surfing. It's just have fun. So that was different. But they were definitely very concerned that I was, done. And they had no more hope for me. But what I found, it kind of led me to deepen my path and deepen my purpose. And arguably, I even think my full-time job, I do better at it because of the things that I learned in the ocean.
And I'm sure courage is one of those. I want to hear about Los Courage Camps. It's a movement that you mentioned that you started, you wanted to teach, and you had this idea, these seeds that kind of connected, and you said, I still want to teach. I have this love for the ocean. How did you start Los Courage Camps?
Man, courage. It's definitely courage. I think I always say I believe that courage is the tipping point between living a life of fear, hesitation, fill in the blank there, and a life of full possibilities, endless possibilities of love, of passion. And all it takes is realizing what your courage is and how bountiful and endless it is. But I was learning to surf and call me crazy, but as soon as I was starting to realize the lessons that the water holds, and really now what I realize, it's our connection back to ancestors. We are made of water, and water is our history. Especially for me, my family is from a coastal state back in Mexico. I started to do a lot of emotional work, but also just realizing like, wow, I'm capable of so much more. If I can conquer the waves, imagine what else I can figure out. And in those thoughts in the water, I was maybe 3, 4 months into surfing myself when I decided to start bringing some of my students. So now to clarify, I was still teaching and I started to bring some of my students with me. And these were some of my more challenging students who just other things at school just weren't helping them turn it around. And so 2 kids took me up, and then it became 5, it became 10. I remember one time we opened it up to the community at large. We had 30 kids show up. We did not even have enough wetsuits and surfboards for all of them. But it was just, hey, this is changing my life. And so I want to make sure that other kids have a chance for this to impact them like me. And it wasn't even a nonprofit at the time. It was just Miss Carrillo bringing kids along with her, and those kids bringing more kids, very, very grassroots. But I knew I was onto something because consistently parents would say, I always wanted to learn to surf, and I never got a chance to learn. And so now that I have a kid, I want to make sure that they get that chance to learn something completely different. So there was something in the water, literally and metaphorically, and I knew I had to figure it out.
That's beautiful. And, part of the mission of Los Courage Camps is to provide access to the ocean, confidence, and leadership. What is a kid's first experience coming into the water? Well, maybe coming into the water as a surfer, because I'm sure, some kids have been to the ocean. Believe it or not, there are kids that have never been to the ocean. That's something that I learned when I was working in education. And we would do beach cleanups. There's folks who have never been to the beach, which is crazy, especially here in LA. We have close proximity to multiple beaches, but what is that child's first experience participating in something like this?
So Courage Camps has now become a full-fledged nonprofit. I still have a full-time job aside from my community work, but there's no way I wouldn't do it. We bring Black, brown, diverse youth from the neighborhoods where people don't often or ever get to experience the ocean, to your point. Even though we live in LA and I went to the beach 2 times in my entire childhood, grew up here my entire life, and that's not uncommon for LA kids. And so when they show up, they're either really, really excited and already getting ready to run into the water, or they're really scared because the ocean is a scary place. We live in LA. It's not like you could see the bottom and see the sand. And so wherever they are in that experience, I think there's like, I always say the 51-49 formula. Like, are you 51% excited and 49% nervous? Again, some kids vary where I'm like, get out of the water, you gotta get out. But um, you can always see it in their body language and like how they're not making a lot of eye contact and they're, curving their shoulders and they're nervous and they don't want to talk too much. And slowly, like we start to warm them up to the idea that the ocean is a happy place and it's a safe place, and help them put on wetsuits. We call it the wetsuit wiggle so that they can feel comfortable getting into something that is so uncomfortable. Some of them don't have proper swim gear, and so we always bring donations of new swim gear that we receive from sponsors or vendors so that we make sure, because I remember when I first went to the beach as a little girl, the one of two times I wore a t-shirt and some gym shorts. And once I did try to go in the water, and those shorts, I don't even know where they ended up because it's not proper gear. So then we also make sure that our volunteer base is heavily diverse. Um, I would say we probably know almost all Latino surfers in Los Angeles at this point and have built community with them. And they show up almost the entire summer, almost every Sunday to surf with our community and teach them how to surf. But the nerves continue really up until the point that we start to take the kids one by one into the water. And it's really interesting how the water starts to wash away those fears. And at first, they're still really scared and they hold on to your hand. Maybe they don't want to do it anymore, but you encourage them. You remind them of, hey, it's safe. Look, we could touch the bottom if you need to. Really, that guided practice and courage of literally and metaphorically taking small steps into the thing that scares you. And like after 10 seconds in the water, they're like, wait, this isn't that bad. And so many people never have a helping hand to get them in the water. And when they finally catch their first wave, again, with a coach, with somebody waiting on the shore to catch them, um, the smile really tells you that something in them has changed. And then they're ready to try again. And they're like, more, 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 and they just are so proud. Like they stand differently, their face looks different. There's a little light that turns on inside of them, and I hope someday I get a chance to do some kind of study. But they leave, you almost don't recognize some of the children from the moment they arrive to the moment that they leave, and it's because they found their courage. We always bring them together at the end of camp and in a circle, a community circle, ask them what they learned, and they say such beautiful, beautiful things like, I learned how powerful I am. I learned that things are scary until you try them one time. And if we removed ourselves from the beach, from the ocean, when wetsuits, you can put them in any other environment now, and they would still be able to say those things and express those life lessons. And I just think about little Giselle, if she had gotten a chance, and you've actually learned with us too, Axel.
I did.
So little Axel too, if any one of us would have gotten a chance to do activities that taught us how limitless we actually are, and that it's okay to be the first in our communities, and to take these lessons back to other places in our lives, which they do. And a lot of parents write back to me or call me or text me and say, you know, Genesis was so shy in school. She didn't want to try different things. And now we don't even recognize her. And so there's other waves of change that happen for them back in their neighborhoods. And it's the ocean that unlocks that for them.
I think it's so true. And you mentioned I took a lesson with Los Courage Camps, and at first I was very nervous. I'm not gonna lie, and just to provide a picture, there's like all these children, and then there's like me learning. Like I would probably fit more the role of an instructor with like how tall I was and everything, but it was really such an amazing experience to go from the training on on the sand and hearing from the instructors, and then going out into the water. I was nervous, I fell down, I was underwater, but towards the end there was this peace that the water provided, and it was so weird because I felt like I was just like in this moment where I'm like, oh my god, like my soul's like levitating. I just tuned everything out, and I just felt like it was me in the water, and the waves would just like crash, and I was laughing, and It was truly a different experience. And I think then is when I really realized the power of this movement and how you're bringing this joy to these communities who are underserved and don't have the tools or the access to these type of sports. When did you realize that this movement was something bigger than just you as the powerhouse behind the idea?
I think it's when there have been many moments, but the most consistent one is when I have parents who I'm not personally connected to, and that's more common now than it was initially. But parents who saw a story about Los Courage Camps, a news segment, saw us in a newspaper somewhere, and they drive from, somehow get a ride or make sure the car's available for a drive all the way to the coast. And not knowing anybody, they still show up. And they show up with, equipment that they bought the day before, or maybe they had stored it for a while. And they show up and they tell us, like, I came because I want my boy, girl, whoever, to see other strong, courageous Latinos, or people that are different or look like them. I want my child to see that there is a different way to be. And so they're not even necessarily there for the surfing, they're there for us to be role models to them, to be big brothers and big sisters. And I am not a mother, but I can only imagine how powerful that is to say, hey, whatever that is, I want my child to experience that. And I choose these people to be role models for them. I think that's when I knew that we were onto something much, much bigger, that people come because they want um, their children to experience a sense of empowerment through meeting other people that can kind of already show them like, hey, there's a different way or there's a different path. So that has definitely been, and it happens, a few times every year where I'm like, wow, this family sacrificed a lot to be here today. And it especially became really obvious last year when being out in public as a group of brown people is very vulnerable. And we made a really great plan to keep everybody safe. um, that was powerful to me that we continued to show up in a very proud way at the beach. Nothing can really stop us. And so, so many others to share, but I think that would be the main one.
I think that's amazing. And I think far from just parents who participate and bring their children, you guys have caught the attention of so many other individuals. Specifically, one of the ones that was amazing, and we featured it when we had our Champion in the Community event, was your feature on Apple TV's Gutsy Woman, which was a show that was produced and put together by Hillary and Chelsea Clinton. How did that opportunity come to be about?
They slid into my DMs. So I just received a mystery message, and we've been so lucky to be on the Today Show, to be on Despierta America, to be part of commercials. Really honored that our story gets chosen over and over again, and I get to be one of the spokespeople for it. And then I had this message from a anonymous producer, so I didn't even know if it was real. And they said, "Hey, we found your story, and you are exactly what we're looking for in terms of gutsy women." I didn't know who would be interviewing me, and they didn't tell me, I think, until like 2 days before. But this is where I am like, I just believe that the universe will guide me to the right things. And I said yes without knowing exactly what I was getting myself into. And they said, great, there's going to be a production crew and we'll meet you at this beach. Bring 5 of your students and bring your mom. And so then they told me who it was, Chelsea and Hillary Clinton. And um, my mom was nervous because they wanted her to be part of the interview too. And I realized then too, and I realized this at camp, that when we teach one child in a family to be courageous, it actually has a ripple effect on the entire family. And my mom has become more courageous. She's terrified of the water, but now she actually shows up. You've seen her at our events.
Yes.
She's less fearful. We actually took a trip together, a mother-daughter trip to Cabo, and she actually put her feet in the water, which I was very impressed with. But she was really nervous to be on television and be interviewed. She still mainly speaks only Spanish. And the courage just came up for her to be able to share that moment and share my story next to my mom felt like intergenerational healing. And I remember she said that she felt like Cinderella because there was producers making sure that she had water and that she was good. And I can imagine the five little girls that came with me that day to also be part of the surf lesson with Chelsea Clinton felt like Cinderella too. Or I hope that they say, hey, this is a bar for me moving forward, and I will only continue to have greater and greater experiences from now on. I hope that they never get to experience something less than, hey, your story's powerful, your story's important, your story's on TV. And so it still feels like a complete honor to be on that show with advocates of the environment. I think my episode was Forces of Nature. So um, I, you know, I got to meet Dolores Huerta through that work and through the premieres and interviews we did after, to also be in the same episode as Jane Goodall. Like 30 women were selected for this, and I was one of them. And that just still gives me the chills that that's the power of our story. And that's the power of bringing your community with you, of healing, of finding ways that we creatively, um, remember who we truly are. And we're truly courageous and powerful people.
I think it's such a full circle moment to go from, that quarter life crisis you mentioned, feeling very down and feeling like, you didn't belong in these spaces. And to now, fast forward to this point, you're being represented as the representation for the movement that you started and the work that you were doing and just being a gutsy woman. So I always am mesmerized by the opportunities that Los Courage Camps has been presented because they're very, very well deserved. And, all the press and all the amazing support, it truly like transformed lives. And I think that's the importance behind the movement, that not only do you have the faith and support of the people around you in that circle, but people that just from the outside look in and say, this is something great, we're going to help. Um, Being featured alongside the powerful woman that you mentioned, what does that level of visibility mean to you?
It means that I am representing Latinas, that there can be a little girl that is sitting watching, Apple TV and is like, what's that, mommy? And turns on Gutsy. And that I, very similar, and, it's powerful to meet Dolores because I studied her and I read about her as a little girl in school. And then you meet somebody who has been a voice for your community, and you're like, oh man, now I'm that voice, and I'm not at the scale yet of what Dolores
Yet.
Huerta did for our community and for farm workers, but to know like she's just a person just like me. Even meeting Hillary and Chelsea, they're just people just like me, and we are capable and we are able, and we have there's a way for us to be that voice for our community and uplift our community. And so it's a very humbling, scary, overwhelming realization that like you are the face of the community and you are a voice for the community. And activism is hard. Like I said already once before, it does not pay my bills. It doesn't help me help my family, but in many ways it does help me help my family, just uplifting our story. Um, so yeah, it's an honor, but it's a bit of it's a large thing to carry. I even think about like how I carry myself, being somebody that lives in LA. And it's but it's something that I know I'm the right person to do too.
Whether that be elementary school or college age Giselle, what do you think all of this means to her, looking back and reflecting with your younger self?
Yeah, so younger Giselle, I think about her a lot. And actually, when I talk about my quarter life crisis, I had a powerful dream where I actually got to see her. And it was just little me, 7, 8 year olds, me, really unsure of what I was supposed to do with life. And I remember actually like guiding her to a place. Dreams are weird, very symbolic. But if I could talk to little Giselle, I think I would remind her that she's always been different. And that's been part of my magic, is that I haven't been like other people, even within my community. I always dreamed a little too big. I always was curious a little too much. I always was just very different and it didn't fit the molds of what other people were doing back then. So it led me to be very much a loner, very much feel like maybe I'm a little too different. Um, I love to read and I love to learn, and that's something that continues to be maybe a little bit of my secret recipe now that I'm a sponge. Um, so I think I would just remind her that like you're on your way to something really special. And just because it doesn't look like other people's path or destiny, it doesn't mean it's wrong. Some of us are late bloomers, and I still argue that I am. There's so many things that have come much later in life. Surfing, martial arts, writing a book, and I'm grateful for it. So I wish I could just remind her to just relax and that it will work out in the way that it has to work out. And that being brown is a beautiful thing because there were many moments, even growing up in my community that was mainly brown, when I went to college, where I kind of was like, it's so hard to be brown. Like, maybe it would be better if I wasn't. And so I also would want a reminder of that, that like our story is powerful and beautiful. Even though I think at some point she questioned that, I'd love to show her the episode of Gutsy, honestly, just so she could see it's gonna be all right.
Courage is the space between fear and hope. How do you think your definition of courage has evolved from childhood to now, or even just starting the movement to now having the wisdom, the experience, and the opportunities that you have under your belt?
Yeah. I think I used to say, and it changes and doesn't, but maybe it's just I've added more to it. I think in its simplest form, it's doing something that you couldn't do before or thought that you couldn't do or weren't willing to do. And it's for me, it started a lot with physical endeavors, not being an athlete, and then all of a sudden saying, I can't even swim, but I'm going to figure out how to surf. That physical experience became a mental experience. I think more about like, how do I sustain this and keep it going? Running a nonprofit, especially in this climate where DEI has been incredibly defunded, I ask myself sometimes, like, how do we keep it going? And sometimes it continues to be able to survive every wave of what the world is going through. It's a tiring time to be a brown person, but how do I keep it going? How do I keep the energy behind it? And although before I think it was like try everything and experience everything and do all the things you're scared of, I think a little bit more right now in my late 30s, I'm like, okay, I think I found the things that I want to be courageous around. How do I keep sustaining them like a garden and making sure that the energy is steady versus like these power punches that I was going through in my mid 20s? If that helps answer the question. I think the tempo changes a little bit, but it's going back to the things that you value the most. And I think it's less about breadth and more about depth. But courage is I still get scared of the ocean. I still get scared. And so the feeling comes back, but it's like, okay, how do I take it one step above? I don't know if that helps, but
It does. No, and I think you're so right. I think, and I think it's part of life, right? Like when you're young, you're so eager to learn everything, and situations change, right? When you're living at home, then you're following your parents' rules. But then once you move out on your own, there's so much more that you have to discover, right? Even down to the funny things like what type of wine do you like? Like there's just so much life to discover. And I think once you've passed that period of discovering, you really can hone in on the things that make you happy and the things that bring joy to your life. Really just watering that section of a garden makes it grow faster. And I think you perfectly described that. You have mentioned, people of color are facing troubling times right now. What do you think courage looks like for our community, and what does that resilience look like moving forward, for all of our community, first gen, and just everyone that makes up this beautiful community of color?
thank you for this question because I think it is a bit of my evolution. I've advocated a lot for brown people in sports and in the water. And I think now I'm advocating more for something a little different, which is brown joy and black joy and people that are different living in joy, even and more so in trying times like this. When everything started happening in our worlds, I was actually on a trip in Greece. which was really hard because I was incredibly far away from my parents. I felt like I needed to get on the next plane and come home. And as I talked to them, I realized like, you can stay, Giselle. They will be fine and you'll get home in a couple days. But I was reading a book called Emergent Strategy. I know I've referred to a lot of books, so I don't know if you can credit them. I'm sorry.
That's amazing. No, yeah.
I'm
Bring
a
it, all the
reader.
books.
I'm the nerd. I'm going to be reading. But in Emergent Strategy, it talked about how in the darkest times, we have to and deserve to live our joy even more so because living in joy is an act of revolution. And so that's why I think now, as times have gone very hard, I sit deeply and my empath heart hurts every single day more and more. And I'm doing what I can for my community. I feel like I started this movement and it's about continuing to carry it forward. If for some people this is the first time that they're like, hey, I got to start raising the flag and finding some way, we all have our ways that we together slowly, like little grains of sand, will uplift our community. So it's about finding your way. I think Courage Camps continues to be my way, while also saying, hey, the best way to get, again, we can't serve from empty cups. So I got to fill it somehow. And I'm sure that there's some people that are pretty mad that there's still a brown woman out there living a great life. I've actually had some experiences where I've encountered that sense that, like, this person probably doesn't love that I'm living out here. Like, nothing is cutting at my joy, even though that morning or that night are going to be or have been really hard emotionally, as I'm worried about my community and my family. But lean into joy even harder because the best medicine for these times is joy.
I agree. And I think it's beautiful to see how our community continues to come together and just do what it does best, which is spread love, unite, help one another. Leaning into that joy is very important during these trying times. And I cannot express how much I like to tell people to lean into their culture and to embrace it, even if they feel disconnected from it, find it, right? I think that's something that I'm working on right now as I'm transitioning from, being a young adult to like working towards becoming an adult. It's like just because my parents didn't introduce me to something or maybe they weren't introduced doesn't mean that I can't go find that on my own. And I think that's the beautiful thing about our culture and the privilege of living in LA, that it's like I can easily drive down so many avenues and find that culture and find other cultures that are represented within the Latino community. And I think that's just the beauty of LA, but overall the beauty of our community, especially during these trying times.
And unfortunately, this has happened before. You know, my parents tell me about La Migra coming to the factories where they worked. And my abuelo was a bracero, and he talked to us about the ways that they were kicked right back out when weren't
Yep.
needed anymore. And it's hard. I actually studied history in college as well. And I think even though day to day this is very hard, it's important to remember that our communities have been through equally hard, if not harder things, and we're going to make it through as well. Um, but yeah, there's so many of us. Lean into each other to your point. We're in LA. In fact, I feel the safest right now in this city. And so, yeah, I completely agree.
That's awesome. Well, before we log off, I just want to talk a little bit more about Courage Camps and the future for it. What are some challenges that you face with Los Courage Camps? I know you've mentioned at the moment that we're in right now, DEI programs are being shut down. These resources that companies and people offer to nonprofits like yours are really like taking the hit. What are some of those challenges that you think are you're being faced with right now?
Yeah, it's in general, even aside from these times, one of the things that I've realized is that inherited advantages are very real in the nonprofit world, similar to the way they are when you hear about really successful company and then you look, and not always, but you look at who their founding investor was and it was somebody's rich uncle. Similarly, this also impacts nonprofits. To be the first in my family to ever open sustain a nonprofit. I have nobody to ask these questions to. I don't have any rich uncles to give me $1 million check. And so it's been challenging from the beginning. And these times, I think the biggest things, three things that really are continuous challenges are how do we get to the youth that need us the most? And more we're finding that it's like 10 times the amount of money to go find those youth, which we are. Last year, we were able to sponsor buses to go into the neighborhoods that need us the most. But it was an incredibly costly summer because we were a full service, even from providing a full lunch, because we knew some of the kids probably didn't have snacks to bring to the beach like other students that we've serviced before. And I think also safety, making sure that, hey, if I'm bringing a group of our community to the beach, that, I have to carry the responsibility of making sure that they are safe in this environment that is really hard to navigate. And so we have good plans and we have been fine before, but it's something that keeps me up at night every time we're about to run a camp for all of last summer. But I have good hope and also a good plan. And then funding continues to be not just from the founding and like how do I run a nonprofit, but it's I work in the profit space too. And like I said, I have a full-time career that is for a big company. And unlike big companies, we can't really generate revenue. We have to always ask for money. And it's hard for me, who was raised on values of, you just grind it out and you don't ask people for things. And what I'm realizing is that nonprofits have to become really good at asking people to give them money. And I'm going to be very vulnerable right now. That's not something I'm really good at because I'm like, I'll just figure it out. And it's a huge bridge to cross where I'm like, yeah, but other nonprofits ask for money and they just boldly ask for money. Why can't I do it? And
Yeah.
maybe interview me in another year and I'll see how I've overcome that. But that's been really, really hard, not just to the act of asking people for money just outright, but also having the network to pull that from is challenging. Courage camps will continue to exist because in our first days we existed with zero money. So but I'm really trying to put ourselves in a position where this can keep existing for many, many more decades in the city of LA. Um, it's a challenge. So we've made it work for so long, we will. It's definitely something I'm trying to figure out. So I don't have answers, just problems right now.
No, I hear you and I
Yeah.
understand. And I worked in the nonprofit sector and I think it's even 10 times more harder having the leadership that is, a community of color. It makes it so much harder because I've worked for nonprofits who help, their populations are to help these under served communities or these communities of color, but their leadership are, reflective of white people. So it's easier for them to ask for money to help, the impacted kids. But I think there's also that barrier that you face being a woman, being a person of color, and running this nonprofit.
Yeah, the same biases that exist when women of color go and found companies, for-profit companies, and are asking investors. I don't have the stats, but I think it's like a small percentage of them that get funded versus men. And I think that's something that's really hard to realize that like I'm fighting the same battles as all women who are founders of something. Yeah.
What advice do you have for someone who wants to start something impactful?
Work on your healing first. It's like figure out what it is in your life that you uh, kind of need to address, heal, soothe. I would not be able to run a community movement. I wouldn't have even gotten the idea for it had I not gone back to do the work and look at all the things I lived through. I think I found a way to live my purpose, and I feel really happy about that. But that would have never happened had I not done the work to like look at my story again and realize where I needed to go. So do the healing work on yourself first. I think then find like the issue you're trying to solve. I think really truly, if you ask me, gosh, what's it been now? Almost 15 years ago, like what world issues do you want to solve? I would have said this and that and this and that. and it's just impossible to solve it all. And so really find like what's the one thing I want to solve. And for me, it's kids and showing them their, immense possibilities in this world, in this life. And also for me specifically, this may not sound great, but it's Black and brown youth. That is who I can relate to. That's who I think I could be a good role model for. And so that's the group I want to impact. Um, and then I wish I had done this, but like you kind of have to pitch it like a business and find your support first. I do think that there's beauty in what we did, which is I just started with what I had, but I always wonder what would have happened if I had also sold it, pitched it, got investment early. Because now we have this massive program that I have to figure out how to keep going while also trying to figure out how to fundraise for it. And like, would it have been different if I had found somebody that believed in the stream? It could have also taken another 20 years. That's always my question. What would it have been like to get funding from the very beginning instead of fighting for it now?
Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your beautiful story full of courage, full of pride in the cultural identity. I think the work that you and the team at Los Courage Camps are doing is important, more so now than ever. Thank you so much for joining us. And how can we find more of you or Los Courage Camps?
Well, we're on social media, Courage Camps on Instagram. I'm Giselle CC on Instagram. You can learn more about Courage Camps on our website, loscouragecamps.org. Come just join us on the beach. We always need extra hands. If you have an employee donation program, we'd love to get donations that way. We know it's a hard time for people personally, but if companies would love to donate, we'd love to hear from them. And just, come meet us. Come meet us at the beach this summer. That's all we ask.
Alrighty.
Thank you for having me, Axel.
Thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.